She had chosen the worst possible room to do it in. 40 people, open bar, the kind of venue that made everyone feel slightly more important than they were. Tall ceilings, soft lighting, the low amber glow of chandeliers that cost more per fixture than most people made in a month. It was Derek Holt's engagement party, and Derek Holt had made sure everyone within his orbit understood the distinction between the people he had invited and the people who had simply been allowed to show up. Calvin Reeves was in the second category. He knew it the moment he walked in. He had driven himself in his '09 Silverado, parked 3 blocks away because the valet line made him uneasy, and stood at the edge of the room in dark jeans and a clean button-down that he had ironed himself that morning. He was holding a glass of water. He did not drink at events like this. Events like this required a clear head. His wife, Simone, was across the room. She was laughing, the kind of laugh she saved for rooms like this one, loose and practiced and directed slightly upward, as if the ceiling itself might be watching and taking notes. She had dressed with intention tonight. The red dress, the heels she kept in a separate box, the earrings that caught the light when she turned her head. She looked extraordinary. Calvin had told her so in the car. She had said thank you without looking at him. He noticed Derek Holt standing next to her. Close. The way men stand when they are performing proximity, rather than simply occupying it. Derek was broad, tailored, the kind of man who wore confidence like a second jacket. He owned 3 commercial properties downtown, a consulting firm that mostly generated PowerPoints, and the absolute certainty that every room he walked into was improved by his presence. He had a loud laugh and a firm handshake, and a way of touching other people's wives on the shoulder that he had perfected over years of practice. Calvin watched. He had a particular skill for watching. It was the mechanic's gift, the ability to observe a system in motion and understand, quietly and without announcement, exactly where the fault line was. He had been watching Simone and Derek for 11 minutes when Derek leaned down and said something close to her ear, and she covered her mouth with her hand and laughed again. Different this time. Private. The laugh she had once saved for Calvin, back when they were young and broke and living in a studio apartment above a laundromat on the south side of Denton, Texas. He set his water glass down on a passing tray and began to move toward them. Not quickly, the way he moved through everything, with the unhurried precision of a man who had already decided what he would find before he got there. He was 12 feet away when he heard it. Honestly, I don't even know how to explain him to people anymore. Simone. Her voice carried the way voices do when the music dips at exactly the wrong moment. Calvin stopped. He's a mechanic, Derek. She said it with a particular softness that was worse than any hardness could have been. He fixes other people's cars. He comes home smelling like motor oil. He has, charts, notebooks full of things he's working on. She made the air quotes with her fingers. I've been patient. I have been so patient. But I am standing here looking at what a life can actually look like, and I think I've been embarrassed for a long time, and I've only just let myself say it. Derek murmured something low and reassuring. He's a good man, Simone said. The way she said it was not a defense. It was an obituary. He's not where I am. He's not where I'm going. Calvin stood completely still. 3 people near him were mid-conversation and did not notice him. A woman in a silver dress caught his eye by accident, looked away, then looked back. She had heard it too. She glanced towards Simone and then back at Calvin with the specific expression of someone who wishes they were anywhere else. He looked at Simone. She had not seen him yet. She was still talking, animated now, that loose laugh again. Then She turned, and she saw him. The room did not go silent. That only happens in movies. What happened instead was that the small pocket of space around them acquired a different quality, something tighter, more alert. Two people nearby slowed their conversation without stopping it. Derek Holt followed Simone's gaze and found Calvin standing there with an expression that was entirely unreadable. "Cal," Simone said it the way you say a word when you realize a moment too late that you left something on the stove. Calvin looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Derek, then back at her. "All right," he said. That was all. He turned, set nothing down, left nothing behind, and walked back through the room the same way he had entered it, unhurried, straight-backed, completely unremarkable. He retrieved his jacket from the coat check. He walked 3 blocks to the Silverado. He sat in the cab for a moment in the dark, his hands on the steering wheel, the engine not yet running. Then he took out his phone and typed one message to a number saved under the name R. Okafor. Legal. It's time. Move all of it. He started the truck and drove home. Please let me know in the comments where you are watching today before we continue. I'm always fascinated by how far these tales can go. Don't forget to subscribe to Old Man Dan's Tales if you like strong, poignant tales of treachery, secrets, and unforgettable retribution. Because this story only gets more bizarre from here on out. The silence in the Silverado lasted the full 40 minutes back to the house. Calvin did not turn on the radio. He drove with the deliberate calm of a man who has just confirmed something he already knew. Not with grief, but with a particular quality of finality, the way an engineer marks a reading on a gauge and closes the notebook. The house was modest, red brick, single story, the kind of house that real estate listings describe as full of potential and in a great school district, when they mean that the countertops are from a previous decade and the garage has been converted into something else. The garage, in Calvin's case, had been converted into a workspace, a serious one. Steel shelving, LED rigging, a long workbench along the south wall that bore the specific archaeology of years of deep concentration, oil stains beneath clear epoxy, shallow grooves from clamps, a burn mark in the corner from the one time, 7 years ago, that a soldering iron got away from him. He had built things in that garage since he was 19 years old. He changed out of the button-down, folded it, and sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water. He did not pace. He did not turn on the television. He sat and thought for exactly the amount of time it took to be certain his thinking was complete. And then he picked up the phone and called Raymond Okafor. Raymond answered on the second ring. "I saw your message," Raymond said. No greeting. They had known each other long enough that greetings were a formality they had mutually retired years ago. "All of it," Calvin said. "The filing, the accounts, the Reeves Ingram Trust. Move everything tonight that can be moved tonight. The rest follows the schedule we set this afternoon. They've increased the offer." "I know." "Cal, they're at $912 million. They are not going to go higher." "Then we take it." A pause on the other end. Not surprise. Raymond was not a man who surprised easily, but something that was adjacent to it. A recalibration. "I'll have the execution docs ready by morning," Raymond said. "Thank you." "You all right?" Calvin looked at the kitchen table, at the grain of the wood, at the coffee ring from this morning that Simone had not wiped up and that Calvin had not mentioned. "Yes," he said. He ended the call, rinsed the glass, and went to bed. He set his alarm for 5:45, the same time he had set it every workday for 11 years. He slept without difficulty. This was not numbness. This was the specific composure of a man who had already done his grieving before the thing that required grieving had fully arrived. To understand what Calvin Reeves had built in that garage, you have to go back 12 years. He was 26. He had been a mechanic since he was 17, first at his uncle's shop on Mercer Street, then at a mid-sized fleet maintenance company, then at his own one-bay operation in a rented space off Route 9. He was good at it. Not just competent, genuinely, unusually good. The kind of mechanic who could listen to an engine for 30 seconds and identify the specific bearing that was failing by the pitch and rhythm of its complaint. His hands understood machines the way some people understand music, not as a technical system to be processed, but as a language to be heard. He had met Simone at 27. She was working the front desk at an insurance company 2 blocks from his shop and had come in because her Corolla had a shimmy at highway speed. He had found the problem, a warped rotor, inexpensive fix, and she had stood at the edge of the bay while he worked, and they had talked for 40 minutes, in the kind of conversation that felt afterward like it had been going on for years. She was sharp, funny in a quick, observational way. She had plans. She was taking night classes, studying for her real estate license, saving money in a dedicated account that she checked every Thursday. She was not satisfied with proximity to ambition. She wanted the thing itself. Calvin had found that entirely admirable. He had found her entirely admirable. They married 3 years later in a small ceremony in her mother's backyard. The early years were good. They were genuinely, specifically good. The kind of good that people who have never been broke sometimes have difficulty imagining, where the smallness of what you have makes the quality of your attention sharper. They ate at home most nights. They drove to the lake on Sundays. They had arguments about real things and resolved them at the kitchen table like 2 adults who had decided to be honest with each other. Calvin worked long hours, and Simone got her license and started building a client base, and they were, by every measure that actually counted, building something together. And in the garage, quietly, Calvin was building something else. It had started as an irritant. He worked constantly on diesel engines, commercial trucks, fleet vehicles, agricultural equipment, and the inefficiency of the standard injection timing system had bothered him for years in the way that a slightly crooked picture on a wall bothers a person with a particular kind of attention. He had not set out to solve it. He had simply begun, on evenings and weekends, to think about what a solution might look like. He filled notebooks. He ran simulations on a second-hand laptop. He built prototypes on the workbench, crude at first, then progressively more refined, each iteration teaching him something the last one had failed to show. He worked with the same methodical patience he brought to every engine. No shortcuts, no assumptions, full attention. By the time he was 33, he had something. He did not call it a breakthrough. He called it a system, a variable geometry fuel injection and combustion timing architecture that, when integrated with the right engine block, produced a fuel efficiency improvement of 31% over the existing industry benchmark. 31%. In a commercial diesel context, that number was not an improvement. It was a revolution. Fleets ran on margins that could not absorb the cost of fuel. A 31% reduction was not a better product. It was a different industry. He had not told Simone about the depth of it. He had tried, early on, had shown her a notebook once, tried to explain the injection timing problem in terms that would carry meaning. She had listened politely and then said it sounded complicated and asked whether he wanted chicken or pasta for dinner. He had said pasta and put the notebook away and did not try again. He did not resent her for this. He understood it. He had also, by that point, quietly decided that he wanted to protect something. Not the invention. The invention would find its own level. He wanted to protect the life they had built from the distorting effect of what the invention might eventually be worth. He had seen what money did to the grain of a relationship. He did not want that. So he filed the patents quietly, 3 of them, through a provisional holding entity he called Reeves Ingram Technologies, LLC, the Ingram from his grandmother's maiden name, a private tribute she would never know about. Raymond Okafor, whom he had met at a small business legal clinic 6 years earlier, handled the filings. The patents covered the core architecture, a secondary thermal recovery system, and a filtration integration that solved a problem nobody had publicly identified yet. Then he waited. The industry found the patents 18 months later. Not the shop, the patents. The provisional filings were a matter of public record, and when the engineers at Hargrove Group, a Tier 1 automotive supplier that counted 4 of the 7 largest commercial fleet operators in North America among its direct clients, ran the numbers on the architecture, there had been, according to Raymond, a specific kind of silence in the room that preceded very large phone calls. Hargrove had come to him with an initial offer of $240 million. He had declined. They had come back at $350, then $480, then $610. Each time, Raymond had conveyed the figure, and Calvin had said the same thing. Not yet. He was not holding out for the number. He was waiting to understand who he was dealing with. He understood now. $912 million. The Hargrove Group. A licensing plus acquisition structure that would transfer the 3 core patents and all associated provisional filings to Hargrove in exchange for an immediate cash payment and a royalty structure tied to deployment volume. Raymond had negotiated a cap on the royalty to make Hargrove comfortable and a floor that made Calvin untouchable. The execution documents would be ready by morning. Calvin had known for 4 months that this was where it was going. He had told no one except Raymond. Not Simone, not his uncle. Not the 2 engineers at his shop, Darnell and Price, who had been his employees for 6 and 4 years respectively, and who knew their boss as a meticulous, fair, somewhat quiet man who drove a 10-year-old truck and packed his own lunch. He had wanted to tell Simone. There had been a specific evening 8 months ago, when the Hargrove negotiation had crossed the $500 million threshold, and he had sat at the kitchen table after she went to bed and thought about what it would look like to wake her up and say the words. He had thought about it for a long time. Then he had turned off the kitchen light and gone to bed himself. He had understood by then that the marriage was already pulling apart at a seam he had not chosen and could not repair. Not because of the money was invisible to her. Because of the way she had begun to look at Derek Holt at the neighborhood association meetings, and the way she had stopped asking Calvin about his work, and the way she had started to refer to people who are actually going somewhere in contexts where Calvin was present and she was ostensibly talking about someone else. She had not yet said it plainly. She had been circling the plain version of it for months. At Derek Holt's engagement party, she had finally arrived. Calvin was at the shop at 6:40 the next morning. Darnell was already there, as he always was. Coffee from the gas station across the street, the bay doors half open, the compressor running its morning cycle. Darnell was 31, rangy, meticulous about his tools in the way that good mechanics always are. Everything in its slot, nothing borrowed and unreturned. The distinction between his cart and the communal supply observed with the seriousness of a treaty. "Morning," Darnell said. "Morning," Calvin said. He hung his jacket on the hook inside the office and sat at the desk for 12 minutes answering emails. Then he went into the bay and started on the F-350 that had come in yesterday with an injector issue. He worked without music. He always worked without music. Music was for people who needed the time to pass. Calvin was never trying to make the time pass. At 9:17, his phone showed a message from Raymond. Documents executed, transfer initiated. Funds clear by end of business Thursday. Congratulations. Calvin read it once, set the phone face down on the workbench, and went back to the injector. At 11, Simone came to the shop. She had never done this before, not in 11 years. She parked her car, the Audi she had bought herself 2 years ago, the purchase she had announced with a careful specificity about it being her money, her decision, and walked through the side door in a blazer and slacks, which meant she had come directly from a showing. She looked around the bay with the expression she always wore in the shop. Not contempt exactly, but a determined neutrality that was harder to bear. "Can we talk?" she said. Darnell, whose bay shared a wall with Calvin's, became very absorbed in his work without moving more than a foot. "Yes," Calvin said. He set the wrench down and wiped his hands. They went into the office. It was small. A desk, 2 chairs, a filing cabinet, a whiteboard with job numbers on it. Calvin left the door open. He sat in his chair, and she stood, which was a choice, and he noticed the choice without commenting on it. "I think we need to separate," Simone said. She said it cleanly. She had practiced it. He could tell by the absence of any throat clearing before it. "All right," Calvin said. She had prepared for several versions of this conversation. His acceptance was not one of them. She blinked once. "I know last night was... I know you heard what I said." "Yes." "I'm not going to apologize for how I said it." "I'm going to apologize for where I said it. You deserved better than that." "You're right," Calvin said. Another silence. She had expected more purchase, more resistance, more pain to work against. His stillness made the room feel strange. "I've already spoken to a lawyer," she said. "Okay. I'll be moving my things out this weekend. I can stay with my sister until we figure out the... Take what you need," Calvin said. "The house is yours if you want it." "The mortgage is current, and I'll keep it current until we have something formal in place." She looked at him for a long moment. "Calvin..." "Simone, do you have anything to say?" He thought about this. He thought about it the way he thought about every diagnostic question, with precision and honesty, without the desire to perform. "I wanted someone," he said carefully, "who could see what I was building before other people told them it was worth looking at." She opened her mouth, closed it. "That's not a condemnation," he said. "It's an answer to a question you'll ask yourself later." She left the shop 11 minutes after she had arrived. She sat in the Audi for a moment in the parking lot. Calvin could not see her from the office, but Darnell, who had a sightline from the far bay, said nothing and found reasons to stay in his own half of the workspace for the rest of the morning. The papers were filed at the end of the week. Standard separation agreement. Assets divided by the most reasonable reading of what was joint and what was not. The house went to Simone. Calvin signed without contest. The shop was his. The Silverado was his. The Reeves Ingram Trust, which appeared on no document in this proceeding, and which Raymond had structured, entirely legally and entirely deliberately as a separate entity from Calvin's personal estate, was not mentioned, because Simone's attorney did not know it existed, and there was no legal mechanism by which she would have found it. Calvin moved into a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of town. He paid 3 months up front. He bought a new workbench and set it up in the 2nd bedroom. He subscribed to the same technical journals he had always subscribed to. His life was, to any exterior observation, unchanged. Simone moved forward. The move forward had a name: Derek Holt. The relationship, which had been operating in the soft implication phase for at least 7 months by Calvin's estimate, became public within 3 weeks of the separation. Derek posted a photograph of them at a restaurant. Simone in the red dress again, Derek in a jacket that probably cost more than Calvin's monthly utilities. The photograph accumulated 342 likes. Calvin saw it because a mutual friend texted him about it, not as cruelty, but as the specific social reflex of someone who doesn't know what else to do with information. Calvin did not respond to the text. He was, at that moment, on a call with Raymond about the royalty structure. Derek Holt, as it turned out, had built something in the past 4 years that looked impressive from the outside: a commercial development company with 2 completed projects, a 3rd in planning, and a funding structure that his brochures described as vertically integrated, and that his actual balance sheet described as heavily leveraged against a line of credit that was itself secured against the assessed value of properties he had not yet finished building. He was not a fraud, exactly. He was something more specific, A man who had borrowed heavily against the future and who had not yet been tested by a future that failed to arrive on schedule. He also had a reputation problem he was not aware of. His consulting firm, the one that generated PowerPoints, had spent the last 18 months as the primary strategic advisor to a regional logistics company called Meridian Fleet Solutions. Meridian was one of Hargrove Group's direct clients. Meridian had 3 months ago begun negotiations with Hargrove to adopt the Reeves injection architecture across their entire commercial fleet. The projected fuel savings, 31%, would restructure Meridian's operating costs so significantly that it would render the existing consulting contract obsolete. Derek Holt's firm was billing Meridian $220,000 a year to optimize fuel efficiency strategies. When Meridian adopted the Reeves system, they would not need that optimization. They would not need the consultant. Derek did not know this yet. He would. The press conference was Derek Holt's idea. He had been planning it for 6 weeks. The occasion was the groundbreaking announcement for a development project he called the Meridian Commons, a mixed-use commercial complex on the north side of town that he had been trying to finance for 18 months and had only recently secured a commitment for, contingent on Meridian Fleet Solutions signing on as the anchor commercial tenant. Derek had booked a hotel ballroom. He had hired a PR firm. He had a podium, a backdrop with his company logo, and a guest list that included the mayor's communications director, 2 city council members, a local business journalist who had profiled him 18 months ago with the headline, "Denton's New Builder," and 23 additional guests from his professional and personal network, all of whom had been strategically selected for their ability to amplify the announcement. Simone was in the front row. She was, by that point, fully embedded in Derek's world, present at his events, introduced at his dinners, photographed at his side with a fluency that suggested permanence. She had begun referring to his projects in the first-person plural. She had made the exit from Calvin's life and the arrival in Derek's with the decisive certainty of a woman who had traded up and was not interested in revisiting the arithmetic. She had said at a dinner 2 weeks earlier in front of Derek's colleagues that her previous relationship had been fine, just fine, but that she'd been playing small and hadn't realized it until she stopped. The people at the table had nodded in the way people nod when they want to be included in someone's arrival. The Hargrove Group's announcement had been scheduled for the same morning. This was not an accident. Raymond had known about Derek's press conference through the kind of legal professional network that operates quietly and without announcement, and he had observed to Calvin on a Tuesday evening call 3 weeks prior that the timing of certain events might be allowed to coincide in a way that was entirely organic. Calvin had said simply, "Make sure the documentation is complete." The Hargrove press release went out at 9 o'clock in the morning. It was not a local business story. It was a wire story, picked up by Bloomberg, by the Wall Street Journal's commercial technology desk, by the specific corners of the automotive trade press that covered fuel systems and fleet economics. The headline varied by outlet, but the substance was the same. Hargrove Group acquires Reeves Ingram patent portfolio for $912 million, reshaping commercial fleet fuel economy for the next decade. The body of every article named the inventor. Calvin Darnell Reeves, the filing noted, was the sole originating inventor of all 3 core patents, operating out of Denton, Texas. One outlet, the one with the longest story, went further. A researcher had pulled the address on the patent filings and cross-referenced it with the state business registry. The note at the bottom of the piece read, "Reeves, 38, operates a 1-bay automotive service shop at 1140 Route 9 in Denton, where he has worked as a mechanic for more than a decade." Derek's press conference was scheduled for 10. He arrived at the hotel at 9:45, phone in hand, moving through the lobby with the practiced momentum of a man performing confidence for an invisible audience. His PR contact met him at the ballroom entrance and said, in a tone that was carefully controlled, there's something you should probably see before you go in." Derek looked at his phone for the first time in 40 minutes. The Hargrove story was already the third result when he searched his own name. The first two results were the Hargrove press release itself, which had been shared by Meridian Fleet Solutions on their corporate LinkedIn page, with a comment that read, "Proud to be an early adopter of the Reeves-Ingram architecture. This changes everything for our fleet economics and our consulting needs." Derek stood in the hotel lobby and read the Meridian post twice. He understood the consulting contract implication in approximately 45 seconds. He understood the anchor tenant implication. Meridian had been the financial cornerstone of his Meridian Commons project, and their pivot toward internal efficiency systems meant the commercial leasing conversations were going to change in ways that had not been priced into his financing. He went into the ballroom because there was no alternative. 23 people were already seated. The journalist was in the third row with a recorder on the seat beside her. The mayor's communications director was checking her phone. Derek walked to the podium. He began his remarks. He was a competent speaker, practiced, warm, the right amount of self-deprecating humor deployed at the right moments. He got through the introduction. He got through the project description. He was mid-sentence on the financing structure when the journalist in the third row raised her hand. Derek paused. "Yes?" "Can I ask about Meridian?" the journalist said. She was not hostile. She was curious, which was worse. Hostility could be performed against. Curiosity was a room with no walls. "Given their statement this morning about the Reeves-Ingram acquisition, are they still committed as your anchor tenant?" The room shifted. Not dramatically, but the energy changed the way a room changes when a question has been asked that everyone was thinking. Derek smiled. "Meridian is a valued partner, and we're in active conversations." "Their LinkedIn posts seem to indicate a change in their consulting priorities," the journalist said. "And I spoke to their VP of operations this morning, who said, and I'm quoting here, that the commercial leasing picture looks different than it did 60 days ago. Does that affect the Commons financing?" Derek's smile did not break, but something behind it did. "We're very confident in the project fundamentals," he said. The journalist wrote something down. The mayor's communications director was looking at her phone again. Two of Derek's professional network guests were exchanging a glance that Derek, from the podium, could not interpret, but that contained an entire conversation. Simone was in the front row. She had heard the question. She had heard Derek's answer. She had, unlike Derek, been paying attention to the specific quality of the journalist's tone, not adversarial, but in possession of information. She had spent enough years in real estate to know the difference between a question asked to understand and a question asked to confirm something already known. She took out her phone. She searched Calvin's name. The Hargrove story loaded in 4 seconds. She read the first 3 paragraphs. She read them again. She looked at the number, 912 million, and something in her understanding of the past 12 years reorganized itself entirely, not slowly. All at once, the way a room looks different when someone turns on the overhead light after you've been sitting in a lamp-lit corner. The notebooks, the garage, the evenings he had spent at the workbench while she watched television in the next room and felt the specific low-grade irritation of a person who is convinced their time is being wasted by proximity to something that has no future. The patents. Filed under a name she had never heard, Reeves-Ingram, while she sat at their kitchen table, 10 feet from where he was building something worth $1 billion, and had felt embarrassed by him. She looked up at Derek, who was still at the podium, still smiling, still performing confidence in a room that had already decided something he hadn't caught up to yet. She looked back at her phone. She left the ballroom before Derek finished speaking. She sat in her car in the hotel parking structure for a long time. Then she called Calvin. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said. Her voice was not accusatory. It was the voice of someone standing in the aftermath of a decision they cannot undo, asking a question they are not sure they want answered. Calvin was quiet for a moment. She could hear, faintly, the sound of the compressor in the background. He was at the shop. Of course he was at the shop. "Because I wanted someone," he said, "who thought I was worth knowing before the world told them how much I was worth." She had no answer for that. There was no answer for that. It was the most precise sentence she had ever heard from him, and it cost him something to say it. And she understood, in the moment of hearing it, that she had never given him the thing he had actually wanted. Not once, not even close. Calvin. "Take care of yourself, Simone," he said. He ended the call. He set the phone down on the workbench. He picked up the wrench. The F-350 was still there. Different job now. A cooling system flush that Darnell had prepped for him. He rolled the stool under the frame and got to work. 6 months later, Derek Holt's Meridian Commons project did not close. The financing contingency tied to Meridian's anchor tenancy was not met because Meridian's commercial real estate needs had been restructured following their adoption of the Reeves-Ingram system, which had reduced their operational overhead by nearly a third and allowed them to consolidate from 3 locations to 2. Derek's lender issued a formal notice of contingency failure. The construction loan did not convert. The project went back to planning. His consulting contract with Meridian was not renewed. The non-renewal letter was 3 sentences: professional, cordial, and final. Derek's firm, which had been leveraged against the projected revenue from both the Commons development and the Meridian consulting retainer, entered a period of what his accountant described to him in a meeting in a smaller office than the one he'd had 12 months ago as significant restructuring. He was not ruined. He was smaller. He was Tuesday morning smaller, the kind of smaller that doesn't make the news, that doesn't produce a dramatic scene, that just means the key card still works, but the floor plan has changed, and there are fewer people on it. He was still a competent man. He would build something again. But the specific version of Derek Holt that had stood at the edge of a party in a tailored jacket and made a woman feel like an upgrade had lost its structural support. The ground it had been standing on belonged to someone else. Simone's life in the aftermath was not dramatic either. That would have been easier. The social circle that had formed around Derek's orbit, the dinners, the events, the people who knew her as Derek's partner and who had, in that context, found her interesting, became less available as Derek became less relevant. This was not cruelty. It was the simple physics of proximity. She had built her social presence in the last 8 months against a platform that was contracting, and the contraction was indifferent to her feelings about it. She still had her real estate license. She still worked. She was not destroyed. She was not even, in most of the ways that counted, dramatically different. But the specific version of herself that had stood at a party in the red dress and said, with the ease of someone finally free, that she had been embarrassed for years, that version had gone quiet in a way she was still getting used to. She had tried twice to reach Calvin in those 6 months. Once to ask a practical question about the house, which he answered with the brevity of someone who has nothing against you and nothing for you either. Once to ask, not directly but hovering around the question, whether there was any version of a conversation they could have. He had listened to her ask it, had been neither cold nor warm, and had said that he hoped she found what she was looking for, and meant it, and ended the call. He did not hate her. That would have been a form of connection, and he was finished with connection to this particular story. Calvin sold the Route 9 shop to Darnell 8 months after the Hargrove transaction closed. The price was fair. It was not a gift. Calvin had too much respect for Darnell to obscure a business transaction with charity. But the terms were structured over 12 years, with a rate that Raymond described as aggressively patient. Darnell, who had spent 6 years watching his boss arrive before him and leave after him, and pack his own lunch and drive the same truck and say almost nothing that wasn't necessary, and mean everything he said, Darnell took the keys and stood in the middle of the bay for a long time. "You knew, didn't you?" Darnell said. "The whole time. You knew what you had." "I knew what I was building," Calvin said. "I didn't know what it would become." "Feels like you did." Calvin considered this. "Feels like that," he allowed. He drove the Silverado to a shop in Abilene and had the engine rebuilt. He did not buy a new truck. He had considered it, had been advised by 3 different people in his new financial context that a different vehicle would be appropriate, which was a way of saying that it would signal the right things to the right people. He had thanked those people and kept the truck. He moved to a house outside Denton. Not a large house, but a property with enough land that the garage he built on it was the size of a proper workshop. He had 3 projects going. None of them were for money. They were the specific kind of problem he had always been drawn to. Systems that no one had solved yet because no one had sat still long enough to listen to what the problem was trying to say. He was, by the most meaningful external measure, rich. He was also, by the only measure he had ever actually cared about, exactly the same person he had been at 26 in a rented bay on Route 9, working with his hands on something that most people couldn't see the point of yet. He was at his nephew's Little League game on a Saturday in March. The boy's name was Terrence, 8 years old, left-handed, utterly convinced that he was about to become the greatest shortstop who ever lived, when his phone buzzed with a message from an engineering contact at a Tier 2 supplier in Stuttgart. They had read the patent filings. They had a thermal recovery problem that was eating their production timeline. They thought he might have a thought or two. He watched Terrence miss a ground ball by approximately 4 feet, recover it with tremendous conviction, and throw it 17 feet wide of first base. Terrence looked at his hand as if the problem were there. Calvin smiled. He typed a brief reply to Stuttgart. Then he put the phone away and watched the rest of the inning. He had nowhere to be. He had never had anywhere to be. He was simply undeniable. The question isn't whether she should have looked more carefully at what he was building. People see what they're taught to value, and she had learned to value what made noise. The question worth sitting with, the one that doesn't go away when the screen goes dark, is this. How many people in your life are building something real in a room you've never thought to look into? And what exactly is it about the quiet ones that makes us so certain there's nothing there?